Hello and welcome to a new edition of the Fitch Ratings Fixed Interest podcast, where we will discuss the impact of US policy changes in the areas of trade and collective defense on European sovereigns. My name is Jan Friederich, head of Europe, Middle East and Africa Sovereign Ratings, and I'm joined today by Federico Barriga Salazar, head of Western Europe Sovereign Ratings at Fitch, to discuss the impact of these changes on European sovereign ratings. So, Federico, let us start with trade policies. How do you assess the impact of US tariff changes on Europe, and what are the possible next steps?
Thank you, Jan. As a recap, let me remind listeners of what is currently the state of play. So, at present, there are three broad categories of tariffs placed by the Trump administration. First, there's a 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum placed in February. Second, there's 25% tariffs on imported vehicles that was announced in March. And third, there's this 10% on all imported goods after this tariff date, but which includes pharmaceuticals, semiconductor, and energy items. Generally speaking, the exposure to current US tariff varies significantly among EU countries. While tariffs on steel and aluminum don't have a large impact on any country in the region, tariffs on vehicles are much more significant for countries with large car manufacturing and part industries such as Germany, Italy, and the CEE. Tariffs on all imported goods impact those with higher share of exports to the US, with Germany and Italy again the most exposed of the large economies. Countries such as Ireland and Denmark have a significant exposure in areas such as pharma and could see a significant impact in the event that this sector is included in a further round of tariffs. At present, we calculate the effective tariff rate in Europe ranging from a low of 1.9% in Ireland to 24% in Slovakia, with the five largest economies in Europe having an effective tariff rate of around 11%, from less than 1.5% prior to the recent US tariff announcements. We assess that these measures, combined with rising global uncertainty and indirect effect of slowing US-China trade, will have an important effect on the European economies. Already in March, in our March CEO, we started to revise down growth in Europe given Trump policies. In our ad hoc global economic outlook published in April, which we undertook to take stock of the latest trade announcements, we revised down our Eurozone forecast even more by an additional 0.2 percentage points, meaning that we now estimate growth to be 0.6% this year, coming down from 0.9% in 2024. We have also revised our 2026 Eurozone growth forecast by 0.3 percentage points to now only 0.8. Fitch forecasts Germany's economy to contract by 0.1% in 2025, Italy to grow by 0.3%, France by 0.5%, and the UK by 1%. Only in Spain, we forecast growth of 2.3%, again much stronger than in recent years to reflect the strong carryover and limited impact of direct tariffs. These forecasts are subject to significant uncertainty given changes to the scope, timeframe, and persistence of US tariff policies. Importantly, the EU has been very cautious in terms of announcing retaliation measures to prevent further weakening of economic conditions. At present, only modest retaliation measures have been announced in the context of the steel and aluminum tariffs. It is possible that further EU measures are announced, particularly the EU reimposes more punitive tariffs or on specific sectors, but the sense we have at the moment is that Europe would prefer to find a negotiated solution rather than escalate the trade conflict. Already, various governments in Europe have hinted that they can muddle through with the 10% universal tariffs and turn the page on the trade chapter.
So, as you mentioned, growth will be quite weak. The impact of these tariffs will be significant. In policy terms, how is Europe reacting to these challenges, and is there potentially any upside?
So the massive policy uncertainty from the recent US tariff policies has clearly put pressure on European policymakers to react, and this is beyond kind of the retaliatory measures. And some of them could potentially bring an improved outlook to Europe. So let me mention a few of them. So in the first place, the European Union is a trade heavyweight and could presumably play an important role in forging a multipolar trade world by maintaining relatively open trade and investment policies with various regions, let's say outside the US and China. The EU-Mercosur agreement is often mentioned in this regard, and in theory is an example that not all countries or regions are willing to follow a more protectionist stance. The problem here, of course, is that internal divisions with the EU on such agreements tends to persist, and thus far progress has been relatively slow. A second point worth highlighting is that the EU could take advantage of the external headwinds to implement long-standing structural policies to strengthen the bloc and make it more resilient. As we have noted in the past, Europe forges ahead in time of crisis, and this could be at the moment when member states and the Commission work to implement reforms, for example, to deepen the integration of the capital markets or renew investment drive in digitalization, infrastructure, etc. A third element, and I think it's important also, it's that individual countries could show more resilience to the shock without necessarily a coherent EU response. In countries like Italy, for example, there are already some lessons learned from previous trade dislocation. I'm talking about China 2 decades ago, with the country having a very diversified trade portfolio with low demand elasticities, which could suggest that the impact of US tariffs could be lower. Another important element is the German fiscal bazooka program, which could offset the rise in uncertainty not only in Germany but across the Eurozone. And interestingly, in recent days, we've seen the first batch of soft data, which do not really point to a collapse in domestic expectations since the announcement from the US. The last point I like to make is around the potential benefits to Europe if there's a fundamental weakening of trust in US institutions and the dollar in particular. Already we see that funding conditions for Europe have not deteriorated as a result of US events, and this includes an increase in US yields, and the euro at present has strengthened vis-à-vis the dollar. A more fundamental shift of risk perception towards the US could also potentially benefit Europe if the region is then seen as a safe haven, which then could have a positive spillover for funding and investment, although I have to say that at present it's very difficult to predict such an outcome.
Thank you. So another important development has been around the US collective defense commitments and shifts in the US's geopolitical priorities. How does that affect Europe?
Yeah, the second aspect and perhaps more fundamental shift in US relations has been heightened uncertainty among European countries, particularly those that are part of NATO, about the future US military support and involvement. It has become increasingly clear that the US is less intent in providing the same level of security guarantees as it has done in the last 8 decades. And this is forcing Europe to reassess transatlantic relations, in particularly around security areas. Pressure from the US on Europe increasing its defense outlays is not new. It was already building up even before the first Trump presidency. And I think it's fair to say that many European countries failed to meet additional spending commitments in the last decade. Trump has renewed this pressure, advocates raising defense spending to 5% of GDP from the current 2% target. And incidentally, in 2023, only 10 out of 32 countries in NATO had reached the 2% target, rising to 23 in 2024, according to June preliminary data. But now the sense of urgency is much greater, with a large share of European countries discussing and pledging additional defense efforts in the last couple of weeks. In June, there will be a NATO summit, and we think that NATO spending targets will be increased to somewhat between 3 to 4% of GDP. Overall, Fitch expects additional but gradual increase in defense spending, with a median spending increase in Europe of just 0.5 percentage points between 2024 and 2028. This, however, highlights some important regional differences, with countries closer to Russia and those with greater security interests seeing steepest increases. That is, the Baltics, the Nordics, and Germany. Countries where the perception is lower, for example, due to the distance or different political dynamics, but also those with higher debt or fiscal deficits, are expected to raise defense spending more moderately or not at all. Finally, the EU has estimated an additional 650 billion of potential additional defense spending until 2028, but we think these forecasts are ambitious given the country-specific considerations I just mentioned. Relative to a baseline of constant defense spending as a share of 2024 GDP level, we expect additional spending of less than 400 billion over the next 4 years.
Okay. Still, these are significant sums, so what are the potential credit implications of higher defense spending?
So after the various successive shocks we've seen in recent years, public finances are one of the key, if not the key driver for most of the region's sovereign ratings. The highly heterogeneous fiscal positions across European sovereigns means that some can absorb a rapid increase in defense spending without a significant impact on their medium-term debt dynamics. In general, we find that most of the countries with the fastest expected increases are highly rated, and in some cases with significant rating headroom. Denmark here is a case in point where we expect close to 2 percentage points increase in defense spending by 2028, the fastest in all of Europe. According to our calculations, based on a recent bottom-up report we published, we expect 7 sovereigns in the region to increase defense spending by more than 1 percentage point of GDP in 2024-2028, 14 countries to see an increase of 0.5 to 1 percentage points, and 11 countries with lower spending increases or no increases at all. We think that those countries with government debt close to or above 100% of GDP will be less willing to increase spending rapidly and in some cases might implement offsetting consolidation measures, as is the case of the UK. Overall, we don't think that the increase in defense spending will directly lead to rating changes over the short to medium term. That said, a more severe deterioration in transatlantic relations, increased security tensions in Europe, and/or additional spending pressures coming from other challenges, be that aging or climate, mean that the fiscal impact could be more severe, putting pressure on those sovereigns with a weaker fiscal starting position.
Thanks a lot for your insights, Federico. Thank you all for listening. And for more information on sovereign ratings, please visit fitchratings.com/sovereigns. We hope you will join us for the next edition of Fixed Interests.